Thank you, Dan. Am I on?
Sounds like it. Red
For-
button down.
For the record, my name is Craig Wilson. I'm the state's Delta Water Master. Want to extend my thanks for an invitation to appear before you today, and want to congratulate Randy on his appointment as chair. I think the council made a very wise choice. I can't think of anyone better to fill those rather large shoes that are now standing to Randy's left. Anyway, just by way of introduction,
Ideologically positioned.
and kind of distilling the hydrological conditions to their essence, I think you have a lot of charts on this and information from the project operators. But, we're basically, no pun intended, in uncharted waters. We've got very low carryover storage from last year because of the dry conditions. We've had almost no precipitation this year, no appreciable snowpack, little runoff expected. And every weather forecast I've read, from 1 week out to 1 month out to 3 months out, is always all showing, below average precipitation levels. So what this adds up to is drought conditions likely worse than any in recorded history. In fact, I even read an article yesterday from a UC Berkeley professor that it could be the driest year in the last 500 years. So while things could change, we have to plan for the worst. And given this parade of horribles, we have to figure out what to do. And simply speaking, I think we have to do the best we can with the hand we've been dealt. And just to kind of summarize this, I think based on these unprecedented conditions, we have to consider taking unprecedented actions. I'll repeat that. Unprecedented conditions may result in unprecedented actions. So, dispelling with those generalities, I'll talk more specifically about, my role as the Delta Water Master, and more importantly, the role of the State Water Resources Control Board in dealing with some of the drought conditions that we face. And the proclamation that the governor issued last Friday does give a good roadmap for the activities and kind of sets the stage for the board to act in 3 major areas. One, dealing with water transfers. 2, considering modification of water quality control standards and objectives, and thirdly, considering curtailing water diversions by other water right holders other than the projects themselves. Regarding water transfers themselves, as Dan indicated, the proclamation has a couple of fairly specific provisions in there talking about both the department and the water board expediting transfers, and also the board changing the place of use of the 2 operating projects to consolidate their places of use, which again will ease the ability to conduct transfers. Because when transfers take place within a given certain area, service area, between contractors within that service area, the process is very much expedited. State water board approval is not needed. Some people have raised concerns that because of the different purposes of the project, is there some concern about consolidating the places of use? All I would say to that is that the decision that would be made to consolidate those uses is a temporary one. It's subject to reopener, and it doesn't create any vested rights. So I think it's just kind of a temporary measure to try to ease transfers. As far as the water board itself, we do get involved in approval of water transfers that don't involve the projects and just wheeling water between individual contractors in a service area. And I think last year we approved over a dozen transfers with over 250,000 acre-feet of water. We have a very good process set up to expedite transfers. It works well, and it'll work well this year. The question really is how much water will really be available to transfer, and only time will tell on that. I think the more important things to talk about are the last 2 tasks that the Water Board will be involved in. And the first of those is the possible modification of water quality standards and water quality objectives in the Delta. As most of you know, the State Water Board has developed a series of water quality control plans that was last enacted in 2006. And that water quality control plan establishes beneficial uses for the Delta to protect agricultural uses, municipal uses, and fish and wildlife uses. And under the operating water right permits of the Bureau of Reclamation and the Department of Water Resources, it's the obligation of the projects to ensure that those standards are met. And those standards include things such as flow standards, inflow standards, delta outflow standards, and various salinity standards in portions of the delta. This year, as of February 1st, of each year, according to the standards, there's going to be more stringent standards coming into place. The most particular one of those is delta outflow. As of February 1st, the delta outflow standard, if nothing is done, will be increased quite substantially. I believe from 4,500 CFF cubic feet per second to 7,100 cubic feet per second, a pretty dramatic increase. If nothing was done about that, and given the low natural runoff that's occurring, if the projects attempted to meet that standard, the reservoirs would virtually be drained, and I'm not sure if even there'd be enough water to meet those standards, even if that happens. So, we're going to expect some requests for relief, and as Dan mentioned, the governor's drought proclamation did modify some of the provisions of state law to allow the water board to consider temporary urgency change petitions to make changes to the project operations permits to allow modification of standards, and it's going to be a very important thing to consider. The board's process to issue temporary urgency change orders is pretty expedited. Once a change comes in, we would have a minimal amount of notice, but a staff has been delegated authority to act on those in a matter of just a few days. The board could hold hearings or workshops after that decision is made to receive public input more widely and to consider whether any modifications would be necessary. In looking at what might possibly be done by the board, there's a range of options that could be considered. Obviously, one thing would be actions to preserve cold water pool in the various reservoirs in order to meet later needs for temperature control, fish protection. There could be a modification to the outflow requirement to a lower level that obviously has consequences, including salinity impacts on the delta. We have the question of would the projects continue to be obligated to meet those outflow standards? Right now, they are the entity responsible for meeting outflow standards. It could be a situation where we get to a point where the projects are preserving as much pool in their reservoirs as possible. They're exporting as little as possible. They're minimizing meeting diversion demands of their contractors, and if there's very little water left over, they may ask that they not be required to release additional stored water to meet water quality standards. If that happens, and if the board approve that would mean there would be very little water left over for anyone else. Conversely, we could go to a situation where we would modify the standards, perhaps reduce it to a more reasonable level under the circumstances, and still have the obligation on the projects to meet that either in whole or in part. And if that happens, there would be more water available in the delta and north of the delta for other diversions. So there's a lot of key decisions that are going to be made just in the next couple of weeks. We expect to get a petition for temporary urgency use change, probably next week from the projects, and the board staff will act upon that in a matter of days, and probably be followed up by a public proceeding by the board to get more thorough public comment. The third aspect of a board activity called out by the governor's proclamation is the possible curtailment of water diversions by people other than project contractors. I don't know if you recall, several months ago I appeared before the council and made a report on what was called Term 91, which is a permit in existing junior water right permits that are junior in priority to the projects that authorizes the board to curtail diversions under those permits and licenses when the projects are releasing stored water for downstream beneficial uses. The board could certainly consider extending Term 91 like curtailments on a wider range of people, more senior licensees and permittees, and under a worst-case scenario, even possibly to riparian users. It could be that drastic. So, the board will have to work through that. Last Friday, the same day that the governor issued his Dare proclamation, the board did issue a notice of possible curtailment and sent it out to a very wide group of water diverters, putting them on notice that it possibly could be a situation where they could be curtailed later in the season. So just to wrap up a couple of things, as we move forward this year and as some curtailments happen, we will try to have a greater field presence to try to make sure there's an even playing field by people that are diverting and people that are subject to curtailments. We also could have instances where we're looking at possible instances of waste or unreasonable use scenarios. In a drought situation like this, what might have been a reasonable method of diversion in times of plenty might not be considered reasonable now. I use as just one example, widespread use of flood irrigation as opposed to drip irrigation or micro sprinklers, and whether that could be considered unreasonable in certain circumstances if we're really in a pretty dire situation. So just to wrap up, the board will be intimately involved in expediting water transfers, considering modification of water quality control standards and objectives, and considering a wide range of curtailment of diversions by non-project water users. And with that, I will close.